All right, is this better? Great. Welcome to our panel, Forming the Beautiful, Sacred Art and Education. We have 4 wonderful speakers with us today, so we're going to get started to give each of them about 15 minutes, and then a little time for Q&A at the end once they've all given their presentations. So, our first speaker is going to be Andrew Wilson Smith. Andrew Wilson Smith grew up in the South Bend area and was immersed in art and architecture from a young age. After high school, Smith attended the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art and the Florence Academy of Fine Art, but his most formative artistic experiences happened during his apprenticeships with established sculptors such as Alexander Stoddart, Miklos Simon, and Anthony Visco. In 2022, Smith relocated AWS Sculpture Studio to South Bend, Indiana. Smith's ambition is to breathe new life into aesthetic models from the past in order to respond to the particular needs of his patrons in the present day. He achieves this by imbuing naturalistic art with symbolic meaning. By unifying concept and representation, Smith's work communicates on a symbolic level while engaging the viewer's attraction to beauty and mimetic display. In addition to creating fine art, Smith has extensive experience teaching art at the college and high school levels. He was a founding instructor at Gregory the Great Academy and has also taught at Wyoming Catholic College and St. Thomas More Academy. The title of his talk this morning is Integrating the Production of Art with the Education of Aspiring Artists. Please welcome Andrew Smith.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, Caroline. It's an honor to be here with you all. Thank you all for coming. And I'm excited today to be able to present a few thoughts with you and also to hear the thoughts of this other great group. So, a little bit talking about apprenticeship as a model for education, but also to give you a sense of a deeper kind of philosophical approach as well as a technical approach to education. So, welcome to the counter-enlightenment. This is a sort of phrase that I'm using right now to kind of conceive of what even this whole kind of movement intellectually is, the kind of great talks that we've all been hearing over the last few days, all really trying to reintegrate certain aspects of thought and culture and find fresh expression for those. So what do we mean by the counter-enlightenment? Obviously, it doesn't mean a sort of rejection of all the good aspects of the Enlightenment. We don't want to have a new dark age that will bring about. But like the Counter-Reformation, we want to identify those aspects of this sort of important cultural, intellectual movement, and then identify the ways in which they may have erred and bring that back into alignment with a more coherent Western tradition of thought. So just thinking about it as a thought experiment, in physics you might have a counter-enlightenment moment when the sort of 20th century physicists disassemble the mechanistic universe. They say, no, in reality, it's not all determined. We have to understand that the world is more at play than the last generations of scientists have understood. Or in literature, we have a real re-enchantment in literature, right? Characters like Tolkien or Lewis, and then that continuing into the modern age with contemporary people who are rejecting the absolute realism of a sort of post-Enlightenment literature and trying to reintegrate myth and poetry into that. And so in the visual arts, that's what I'll talk about today. How can we identify those aspects of the Enlightenment and how they've played themselves out in the visual culture, especially of the church in the West? What are those trends and are they negative? And I think a lot of them are. So we'll move into that quickly here. So the effects of the Enlightenment on Catholic artistic expression. These are my whole list of pet peeves, right? So I feel like in this early modern period, into the modern period, our visual expression have lost touch with a lot of things. They've lost touch with the mythopoetic aspect of our faith tradition. You know, the feeling is that, the Enlightenment is partially, is as much Catholic as anything else. It's pan-European. The great scientists of that period are, many of them Catholic, many of them clergy. And so it's our own thing, but it also comes with it this embarrassment about what especially Protestants would have called, the sort of hocus pocus aspects of the Roman Church, right? And you feel, as you look at art history, you feel this sense that we're ashamed of the things that don't seem to align with our new enlightened values. So what we really lose touch with, first, are the ways of integrating Greco-Roman mythological traditions into our broader Catholic tradition, right? So there's this great divorce, and the state keeps the sort of Greek and Roman mythology, and that's their means of expression, and the church keeps sort of the biblical stuff, and we're allowed to have that. And I think that before that there was an integration. So just a few quick examples. This great image of Fortuna, right, in Siena Cathedral. Fortuna is not an explicitly sort of Catholic doctrine, but it's part of the broader mythology that you could have these sort of gods of good or bad fortune. The Sibyl, the Cumae from Michelangelo, this is the way to express the way in which there's revelation to the Gentiles prior to Christ. Always my favorite is the baptism of Christ. Any traditional icon of the baptism has this little river god right in the corner here. And that's the god of the Jordan River. Christ doesn't totally exercise that sort of deity from the Jordan. There's still some room for those kinds of mythic things. The other thing, have anybody else noticed there's no more Old Testament imagery in our churches? We haven't had these important, especially the more exciting ones, the big floods, the giant killers, all of this stuff gets pared out, and we just want our very sort of historically accurate, rational understanding of our faith tradition. And so imagistically, we've lost touch with the Old Testament. The last point being, ultimately, Christianity can't and doesn't make any sense if it's not understood within the larger context of the Old Testament. And I think when we don't incorporate that imagistically, we don't know how to understand it as well. So this is not, this great sculpture really by Bertel Thorvaldsen, to me epitomizes sort of post-Enlightenment Catholic Christian art. And this is the sort of period of art history that we've mostly been living in for a few hundred years now. And I'll say what I think is good about it. Sculpturally, it's strong. It's part of this sort of neoclassical revival. And formally, it's a very strong sculpture, but it's also somehow misses that most fundamental aspect of the nature of Christ, of the sort of mixture of humanity with divinity. I mean, it's too divine, right? It's too much of a Greek Apollo and not enough of a human being. And this is kind of the preferred imagery within the mainstream Roman Church for a long time. And part of the problem is most of it's not as good as Thorvaldsen, the great sculptor. So it's very derivative, but it's also embedding this nature. Christ is extremely civilized, right? He's extremely, good at philosophy, keeps his fingernails clean. It doesn't have the earthiness, the humanity that many other formats of Christian art, I think, are better imbued with. And it also, this applies to this particular image of Christ, but I think could be understood more broadly, but I'll just use this as an example. So it devolves very rapidly as well. So I think embedded in Thorvaldsen, it gets then expressed here where Christ is a ghost, right? He's not a human being. I love this one down here where he's walking away from you. He's too hard to grasp. And I don't want to be, it's not to mock, but it's to say that we actually need to find a new basic template to start over again. And I think that template is going to be more readily discerned in medieval art rather than what I think I'm critical of and concerned about is as the church becomes more conservative, it kind of is looking back to the 19th to the 18th century as, oh, that's the good old days, let's get back to this thing before modernism, before Vatican II. But really, if we want something before, I hope that it'll be well before that, to get back to this kind of inspiration from earlier forms. Because if we just go back to Thorvaldsen, then we just land here again very quickly. That's what I'm concerned about. And then ultimately that gets derived all the way down to this very mockable kind of Christ, right? So if the most primary imagery that we present of our Lord becomes very quickly this very kind of pathetic thing, as you see on the cartoon. So moving on, the kind of hopeful signs. These are three painters that I admire tremendously. On this side, Joseph Jude Macklin, a painter in Michigan, working today. His tremendous image here is a life-size image of St. Gerard. And you won't see it here, but going back into the depth, into the background of each aspect of this painting are extremely detailed, complex images of a sort of heavenly city, all of this imagery worked out at tiny scale, and again, being inspired by some of those Northern European Renaissance images, you can find a lot there that's a break with our more recent tradition. In the center, Daniel Mitsui, an artist based here in Indiana, but more near Chicago. He's been doing this tremendous work, these illuminated manuscript illustrations. This one, The Creation of Eve, is from his large ongoing project to illustrate the whole Bible. And you can see again, here's the thing, there's also people who are doing sort of copies of illuminated manuscript from the 13th century, and that's neat. But Daniel has gone to that well and come back with something different, and that's what the proposed thing here is. It's not to be completely a copy of a historical object. It's to kind of go drink from that well and find out what new manifestation comes forward. And on the right, St. Joseph by Matthew Connor. Again, similar but different from Mitsui, looking for that inspiration, but coming back with a brand new thing. And coming back with the elements of, for example, detail. It's very rare in the 19th, 18th century model to get the complexity that you would see in this image of St. Joseph, right? He wants to use this as an opportunity to show you how, construction projects happen, right? And all the different aspects of the work of a carpenter, from the wattle and daub fence to the beautiful Gothic tracery. So those are three that I really admire and think are good exemplars of this kind of counter-Enlightenment production of art. And now I'll just be selfish and talk about my own attempts at that. This is a design that we've been working on this summer, and I've laid it out, the same image sort of zooming. So from that side to this, you can see a very layered, this is a proposed design for a church dedicated to St. Joan of Arc that is proposed to be built in Post Falls, Idaho. And you couldn't do this in New York, but maybe we'll be able to do it in Post Falls, Idaho. And the idea here is to revive forms that we haven't had for years, right? Since essentially the late Renaissance, when all of these forms started to disappear. So for one thing, if we start with behind the altar, we have two works of art dedicated to Joan of Arc. One, her tomb, right? Joan of Arc doesn't have a tomb anywhere because she was martyred, burned, her ashes were distributed in the river so that nobody could ever identify her as a saint and reverence her. And so we need to correct that historical error and create a tomb for St. Joan of Arc, right? So that's the sort of core concept. And above the tomb, an image of Joan in victory. That's a painting that's being designed by Nicola Verlato. And as part of that reredos, to have these sort of three allegorical figures, again, to introduce something that's not exactly, the art of the Enlightenment is very constrained to a few images, to images of saints and a few historical images. But let's have some allegories in there. That would reintroduce a thing that we haven't had for a long time. Now, if you go to that central image, you'll see that whole altar and reredos in the context of the altar wall behind it. And so this proposed painting would be at a very large scale, but also what is its subject? Its subject is the anastasis, or the harrowing of hell imagery. More on that if you see in the center here, Christ defeating Satan, storming the gates of hell, rescuing Adam and Eve from their situation. We haven't used this image as Catholics in 500 years. And it may be an opportunity now to start using it again. Also, a Last Judgment incorporated into this composition. And so it's showing that resurrection of the dead on the last day down here. A thing that we say in church every single time we go to Mass, but if we can't see images of that resurrection, how are we to really conceive or believe it, is my argument. So the resurrection leading to the sort of judgment and to some of the people joining the blessed saints and others. Sorry. Can you see when yeah, the cursor moves there. And again, Nicola, who is even so trained in, he's a terrific painter, Italian painter, but he resisted so much the idea of this monstrous head, the head of the maw of Leviathan sucking up the dead, sort of the damned souls, but eventually was persuaded to put it in there because it is part of that tradition, and you can't really make sense of that image without it. So this return to this medieval imagery would be very exciting and very, groundbreaking, I think, on an artistic level. Again, just some images of the tomb design for St. Joan of Arc, and this great painting of St. Mark being translated into his relics being essentially stolen from Alexandria and planted in Venice. And Venice wanted Mark, specifically, the tax collector. They want the kind of person who brings the money to the city. And there's something delightful about that we've maybe lost touch with. And I think that reintroducing some of that poetic aspect into our reverence of the saints could be interesting. So my sketch here is just really to revive that, to bring Joan in a bodily way into the church. And a few other projects along the same lines that I've done over the years. And again, a lot of this is inspired by medieval models. So a mosaic of Christ, the Jubilee portal, and some Romanesque inspired carvings. So just very briefly, this is all happening in the context of apprenticeship education, and just a few images of that as well. So I was able to open my studio to several young people who were really engaged right along with me in that process. And so that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Our next speaker is Hunter Dickens. Hunter Dickens is a seminarian for the Diocese of Owensboro in Western Kentucky. Before answering God's call, he worked at the Mayo Clinic, designing a 3D printed surgical aid for unique cases. He also served as director of the Sacred Art Institute in Mystic, Connecticut, revitalizing their week-long workshops. Dickens most recently worked in church design and continues to consult for churches on sacred art and beautification projects. He leads a collaborative of local Catholic arts organizations and manages ethicscenter.nd.edu, connecting parishes with Catholic artists. At the National Eucharistic Congress, he led an initiative that brought sacred art commissions into spaces of prayer, and he'll be speaking to us today about the way of beauty in forming local Catholic culture, or any local culture.
I'll give you an extra one to help keep me honest there. Thank you. Yeah. So while he's setting that up, who here is a professional artist, architect, or studying to be one? Can we raise the hands a little higher for me? Okay, and then everyone else who is not, raise your hand if you're not one of those things. Wow. Okay, so thank you so much to both of those groups, but I had written a talk on the way of beauty and then read it to one of my professors, and he said, "That's wonderful. You should write a different one on your story." So you're going to get more of my story, and the reason I ask about who's not an artist, this talk is hopefully to inspire the imaginations in the way of beauty for all of you here, and hopefully you can carry this out to others. So this talk, again, is inspired by the way of beauty. It's more of a practical approach, which is something that I take away from the document that I'll tell you about. The goal here is a formation in beauty that embraces everything within our culture. Well, again, this is going to be a little bit more of my story, some of my experiences. I was born in 1993 to an amazing family from Kentucky. I'm a cradle Catholic, but spent most of my time kind of disconnected from the faith until later in college. I always wanted to be an architect until I went and saw an architecture school, and it was the ugliest building, and knew that was not the group for me. Again, I had fallen away from my faith until I went to a conference in college with Focus, and I was attracted by the beauty, especially within the devotion of the individuals there. It was something I had not experienced in the Catholic Church, unfortunately, and something that really changed the course of my life. This attraction, especially to the purpose and meaning that I saw in these individuals' devotion. While at the University of Kentucky, I was given many wonderful, beautiful experiences to start finding that meaning and purpose in my life. And I'm going to continue on this document. Again, it's from the 2006, the now Dicastery for Culture put out this document called The Way of Beauty. And as I was saying, it's a very practical document on what we can do as Catholics to lead that way of beauty to God. This is one example I'll give. This was a vestment done by a friend of mine in Connecticut. This vestment was a bunch of us out of college. This was someone we graduated with, being ordained, and we all pooled our money together to buy this for him. You know, one example of how anyone can help support Catholic arts. The first thing that the document addresses is nature. So again, I'm giving a talk not explicitly on art, but this way of beauty through nature that it first begins us with. The world is extremely loud. I don't need to tell any of you that. And what this document begins with is nature is a way that we can start to introduce people to listening, to quiet. Something that I don't think that we get to embrace enough as Catholics, to realize, you know, you might not be able to get everyone in the church doors, but you can get someone for a walk. And it especially talks about children and young adults, giving them these opportunities where right now we're feeding them a lot of media. And this says just the opposite. How can we take them into a space that is contemplative, a space that is prayerful? And one of the biggest themes of the document is one that inspires mystery. You know, how can we create this culture of wonder and awe and start to hear God in that? again, at the university, I was able to gain a bit of this prayerful experience, this prayerful understanding. And a lot of people have come into the faith in similar ways to mine, but they do not always get this foundation, and this is something I want to make us aware of, this foundation of prayer. So when I graduated, I was able to walk away with that understanding of the need for that quiet to listen to God, but something we need to be sensitive to those graduating high school or moving on to new places. If they do not have that firm foundation to see this attractive nature of beauty, it's so easy for us to lose them. I left the University of Kentucky and began working in medical 3D printing at Mayo Clinic. This is me being able to give a talk at a rapid conference in Detroit. And this was a career that I started down really unsure of where God was calling me, feeling something, but I'm giving this a little bit of my Forrest Gump talk. I kept finding myself in all these amazingly beautiful places. So thank you for letting me share that with you. When I moved to Minnesota to be here, this was a very transient community. Everyone was coming to these hospitals from around the world and did not really have community built in. And so one of the most wonderful young adult communities that I've ever been a part of, I actually found here on accident. And so this is one of the themes that I want to pull from the document to kind of help get us an understanding of what the document says. The word attractive comes again and again. And I think it's one thing that, for whatever reason, we forget about beauty. It's something that's supposed to attract us. Now, when we talk about these high ideals, we also forget, what can I do with this? And so I wanted to talk a little bit about hospitality and see how each of us can begin this way of beauty that will eventually lead to many of these artistic expressions that everyone else is talking about. One Saturday morning when I was in Minnesota, an elderly woman came up to me, kind of interrupted me in the middle of my prayer and said, "Do you want to come to brunch?" And it did not matter if you accepted or not, you were going to get invited to brunch again and again and again. And that was the way, forgot to keep flipping through these. This actually is the hospital chapel. So just to remind us the opportunities for beauty, when the Franciscan sisters built this, they did not let go of anything to inspire those patients. This is Marjorie here on the left that I'm talking about. She invited me to her house for brunch, and again, the most beautiful young adult community I've ever been a part of was at their tables at brunch every Saturday morning. And her husband, Wendell here, had this idea that they were going to build community in a place where we were all we did not know anyone else, and we found ourselves in a family setting. But this is something that anyone can do, and through that space, I cannot tell you how attractive it was to find something like that. And this really is a way of beauty unlike anything else. The way that she loved each of these individuals too. Marjorie passed away at the beginning of this semester, and it's that relationship is something I hold dear to this day. Another family that really accepted a lot of us would have a home altar. And so we would come over for different meals. They lived out the liturgical calendar at their dinner table, but then every night it would end with a family prayer at the home altar. And this is one of the main things I want to talk to people about commissioning artists. Everyone can have commissioned new art in their homes. It is possible, and it's something that we can all save up for. Again and again, I cannot stress this enough, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. I'm going to flip through these relatively quickly, but this was one of the churches I attended during COVID. They tried to have outdoor masses in this space here, and so we built a temporary altar for this. We painted, again with that family I was mentioning, to create a sense of beauty. We went and purchased golden drapes there. And these little artistic expressions were something that actually grew from that home altar that I was mentioning. The family at different feasts, the children would create little things to put at Mary's feet and things like that. How can we start living out the way of beauty through the liturgical calendar? And we see that it comes especially from the Mass. The next thing I want to talk about is the arts. This is the second piece of that document. So I moved from moved to Connecticut, knowing that God was calling me towards something in the church. That was probably as much as I could define it at the time. I definitely didn't see a collar around my neck anytime soon. And I found myself at Ender's Island Retreat Center. This is a wonderful place that really understood the role of beauty and healing. And I think that's something we all need to understand. If you've been in the hospital setting, you realize there's a unique place for intimacy and beauty in such a place that terrifies us. While I was here, I was able to collaborate with many different Catholic arts initiatives. I know that we have a couple here. Sarah Cortez is here from Catholic Literary Arts. Art House 2B is represented with Claire. A lot of these groups are starting out of nowhere. In the last decade or so, there's this movement of the Holy Spirit that is undeniable for new initiatives in the church, everyone recognizing the need for beauty and not knowing where to go. And all of these individuals that I'm going to be mentioning and have already called out here in person, they just kind of took it on their own, and they found these great opportunities. Other ones I want to mention is the Catholic Art Institute. They host larger yearly conferences, but some of them are even small things. Like one parish had an extra building, and they actually created an artist's house, a house for artists to get rent at a low cost to help get them on their feet. And all of these things are things that I have listed in the Catholic Artist Directory. I have cards and stuff that I've passed around. Different initiatives, kind of not just if you can find them locally for you, but they may inspire you to something else that you may be able to do. The document Way of Beauty, again, talks a lot about education, which I'm going to leave to the rest of those to talk about. But I want to just highlight quickly the formation in beauty that's necessary. How can we, whatever teaching role you have, embrace that, even if you're a teaching catechesis or anything in that regard? One thing I was able to do in my time there was work with, this slide, the addiction recovery group, and I would have a group where we would just meet and I would give them a virtue, and I'd say, let's discuss this virtue, but before we talk, I gave them pieces of blank paper, said draw, doodle, write little notes, one of them was a poet out of nowhere, I did not know this, but they started to find meaning and purpose and asking questions that they never had asked before. And these are young men in addiction recovery. It's anyone can find a way to get involved in this thing. Another group I wanted to mention is in Pittsburgh. So my next place that I moved to was Pittsburgh to work in liturgical design. And this group in Pittsburgh, they found different individuals. The Franciscans here would find individuals that had an interest in, there was one great artist that led a drawing class every month. There was another person later on that came and they were very serious about poetry. Another one was in film, and they would just have a monthly film discussion group. I'm not saying that you need to do each and every one of these things. I'm saying if at your parish or you yourself have an interest in something, see what you can do that relates to the interests of the culture. This is a drawing group that they did. The document again and again says, how can you take what you have at home, look at these parishes, and unite that to the community? So they would go in and draw things there and actually find meaning and find the symbolism throughout the parish. When I moved to Pittsburgh, one of these ideas that I kind of want to embrace in this is probably the one thing that I'm adding in a way to the document, is this idea of parish boundaries. So how can we see that every one of our parishes, the church has given us the ordinary way of this boundary, and everything within that is ours as Catholics to lead in the way of beauty? How can we take that vocation that we've been given and recognize that responsibility? This group was actually a procession was led, and you can see the protesters on the other end to an abortion clinic. And this was one of those beautiful cultural moments that was supported by all of the other things that were being done at this parish. This parish also hosted a home for expectant single mothers. So this wasn't just a one-off thing that they were doing, but another way that they were living out everything within those boundaries. And I'm going to have to flip pretty quickly through this, but just within this one parish, they hosted young adult candlelight liturgies. They would have other things that would meet the needs of the community but would build a local ownership for the individuals. So whether it was the soup kitchen where people could come volunteer, there was a chastity group where men could kind of support each other with those. And they also responded to the needs. So how can our abilities meet the needs of the community? So this here on the right was a coffee shop. When a mother came to the pastor and said, my son has a learning disability, he'll never be able to find work. The pastor said, great, let's start a coffee shop for them to work at. How can we take our abilities and meet the needs? Not in a way that is countercultural. I think we use this word a lot. We are Catholic, we are pro-culture. We are growing the culture and baptizing it. And I think that's one thing we forget again and again. It can meet the interests of our local parish boundaries. I'm going to have to close up pretty quickly on these last parts. This was the Friday morning men's, and they would have a women's mass at the side shrine of St. Joseph. That was a beautiful way for us to kind of build community. The third and final part to this document is life in God. And again, this is this call to holiness, recognizing He is the source of beauty and living that out, letting it shine, as we were talking about in the saints yesterday. The word that comes again and again in this document is authentic, specifically speaking about beauty and liturgy, but also as a bridge, a relationship. It calls beauty the privileged pathway for evangelization and dialogue, the privileged pathway where we can let truth and goodness shine forth, but first they must be attracted to it through the beauty. So in conclusion, I just want to say when we live this authentically out, whatever this is, we are creating a formation in beauty that allows for the arts to thrive. If you have a beautiful home altar and you're inviting people into that home, all of a sudden the parish now realizes the need for that in the church building. It's not something that we can just snap our fingers and expect every person in the parish to understand why we have to spend money on things like this. So again, we live it out authentically, especially through embracing everything within our parish boundaries, through the liturgical calendar, especially in love and joy, the beauty that attracts of Christ. Thank you all.
Thank you, Hunter. Next up is John Haigh. John Haigh is a licensed architect who resides in Atchison, Kansas. Originally from Washington State, Haigh received his MArch from the University of Notre Dame in 2004. From 2003 to 2012, he worked in South Bend under the Arthur Ross Award-winning architect Thomas Gordon Smith, a leader in the contemporary resurgence of both teaching and practicing classical architecture. In 2016, Haigh joined Benedictine College to start a new degree program, a BA in architecture. Haigh is the architecture department chair, and since leading the first classical design studio in 2016, his students' projects are published annually in the peer-reviewed journal, The Classicist. And he is with us right now. I'm a little worried when you're sitting in your chair.
Sorry, we'll go over here to the left. Thank you very much. To Hunter's point about looking at the School of Architecture and walking away from it, at the base of this talk is, if it looks like it and it feels like it hates you, it might not be you. Tell us a story from before we can remember. Most of this is going to be a quick review through the 20th century schools of architecture and what we're doing to repair the education that produces those buildings that walk away from you or shun you. So tell us a story from before we can remember, a line from The Tree of Life, a Terrence Malick film, and hopefully after this story I'll have one sentence about love referring to this title. When a man conforms to the measure of the universe, his freedom is not diminished, but expanded to a new horizon. Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, The Spirit of the Liturgy. When a man conforms to the measure of the universe, ever ancient, his freedom is not diminished, but expanded to a new horizon, ever new. Where are we? Like dropping the little yellow figure into the world of tradition, our story could begin anywhere in tradition. Today we take a dip into Bath, England, where I cherry-picked this remarkable facade, that of Bath Abbey. With its stunning carvings and soaring Gothic lines, it weaves a story from the Old Testament to the present day via architectural inspiration and mythical vision. The textbook description of the facade is that you're looking at a somewhat atypical example of perpendicular Gothic, a style known for its clarity, order, and verticality, which flourished from the late 14th century to the early 16th century. But the carved iconography reveals another story, not covered in a typical architectural textbook. That's the great story of a mystical vision that requires retelling because it represents one of those stories told from before we can remember. This legendary story attributes the design of the Abbey's west front to an extraordinary dream. 30 years before the decimation of the Catholic Church's institutions, particularly the monastic one, and we are looking at a Benedictine abbey here, a former. 30 years before King Henry VIII attacks the institutions of the Catholic Church, trouble was already brewing. However, Oliver King, the new Bishop of Bath and Wells, visited this great abbey church in Bath and was shocked at the years of neglect that it had suffered. It didn't even have a roof. It was not this facade. He observed that its original Norman structure was decaying. One evening, after days spent pondering the future of this abbey, Bishop King retired weary to his quarters in Bath. That night he had a dream, a vision so vivid and awe-inspiring that he would remember it the rest of his life, that of a ladder stretching from earth to heaven upon which angels were ascending and descending, that powerful image of divine connection between grace and the world, the natural world, echoing the biblical story of Jacob's ladder. Above the ladder, Bishop King saw a vision of God himself surrounded by heavenly light and the hosts of angels. At God's side were symbols of the crown and the olive tree, a clear reference, he thought, to his own name, Oliver King. Then a voice spoke to him, saying, "Let an olive establish the crown, and let a king restore the church." The message was unmistakable. He was called to restore this abbey church, and he restored it by placing the image of his vision on the facade of it. Awakening with this profound sense of purpose, he gets to work and gets this facade completely transformed. Now, it's in the central plaza of Bath, adjacent to the ancient Roman baths. This would have been destroyed. However, it is a figurehead of the city of Bath, a civic feature. It is also iconic, the next part of our talk, iconic versus aniconic architecture. Iconic architecture bears stories. This is a very literal version of it. Traditional architecture is iconic in the sense that it uses recognizable forms, symbols, ornament, decorative elements to convey cultural, religious, and social meanings. The approach to design is representational. It celebrates the visible attributes of a particular culture, history, or locality within the framework of the timeless. It represents the story of individual heroes of a culture, as well as the broader story of a society in which those heroes struggle and overcome. All pre-modern styles of architecture support stories across the world. The German architect, art critic, writer Gottfried Zemper states in his 4 Elements of Architecture that pre-modern, he's writing in the 19th century, pre-modern architectural styles throughout the world fundamentally bear the marks to varying degrees of a people's relationship to their gods, either through the restated hearth or altar, the restated ground, restated sky, restated horizon, and that's a whole different talk to give. This idea contains multiple lectures. We're going to focus on the fact that Christian architecture, he found, was almost the perfect integration of all the other architectures of the world, of restating the altar, the ground, our place in the horizon, and particularly our place in the horizon, 1 foot on earth, 1 foot in heaven. And then the revolutions. I won't get into all the revolutions, but the Enlightenment is one of them. And this, first of all, the one on the right is easier to read quickly. The modern world will not be punished. It is the punishment. The quotation on the left drives home a remark because we like to say that the world wars in the 20th century were damaging unto themselves. But here's Charles Bailly in 1910 saying we are the last. That's obviously pre-World War I. What did he see? That it's not just sort of all of a sudden we started bombing the old traditions and cultures. He understood that we were entering a world of the non-serviam, a secular world for him, we were already in. Broadly speaking, no longer seeking to offer nourishment of meaning to our intellects, a culture no longer asking the what or the why of things, rather how. How much does it cost? How will it pay? How will we get there? Here's the story. The age of mass production. Behold the aniconic age, the rise of modern science and the decline of religious cosmology. By World War II, the dominant styles of architecture in the industrialized world were aniconic. Here are your three princes of that movement. And underneath them, I think it's important, although it's small on these screens, Walter Gropius on the far left started in the Bauhaus, becomes the head of Harvard School of Architecture from 1938 to 1952. Mies van der Rohe, also a German, ends up at IIT, Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago from 38 to 59. And Le Corbusier is still read his manifesto toward an architecture, meaning we haven't had an architecture, and the 20th century is going to tell you what architecture is. And you see the products, and I put this, this is not tongue-in-cheek, these guys are all heroes in the modern educational system. All three of them availed themselves of Hitler's empire. They were rejected, so they come here, rewrite the story, and say they are anti-fascist. Now, those books are starting to be rewritten, and the story is being told in a little bit more critical modern way. At the heart of modernism of the 20th century is an industrial assembly line aesthetic, one of efficiency, pure structure, and material. This approach is aniconic. Well, I think I'm going to skip that little bit right there. But conveniently, the styles of avant-garde architecture after World War I employed the same materials and assumed similar forms as what had developed from 4 years of factory-supported supply lines on the Western Front. In many places during the World Wars, the supply lines formed miniature pop-up cities. In the time of Bishop King in the late 15th century, the only pop-up cities occurred at building sites of new cathedrals. In the strive to achieve an everywhere but a nowhere, modernist architecture talks over and beyond us. It seeks the ever-present and at the same time the never-past. In other words, it's the poster child for ideologues working toward any utopian society that will claim to be unburdened by the past. There are no real plans, no precedents other than the eternal, we're not there yet. Stratford Caldecott, in Beauty for Truth's Sake, on the enchantment of education, writes, most of us are prepared to let developments in science and technology dictate the shape of the future. We see our job as being merely to hang on tight, to survive, and maybe take whatever advantages are offered us along the way, smartphone. But in the process, we begin to notice not only that we are damaging the earth and destroying our fellow creatures, but that we are becoming less than human ourselves. In other words, he writes, we have been reduced to producers and consumers. Not news here. Now, let me give you a quotation from each of these gurus that tells you what they're thinking of you. Walter Gropius, Harvard. We want an architecture adapted to our world of machines, radios, and fast cars. Let us desire, conceive, and create the new buildings of the future together. It will combine architecture, sculpture, and painting in a single form and will one day rise towards the heavens from the hands of 1 million workers as a crystalline symbol of a new and coming faith. A new faith. Mies van der Rohe in Center. We reject all aesthetic speculation, all doctrine, all formalism. Not yesterday, not tomorrow, only today can be given new form. Only this kind of building will be creative. Corbusier on the far right, who's read even in my program, but for different reasons. In the last 50 years, steel and concrete have brought new conquests, which are the index of a greater capacity for construction, and of an architecture in which the old codes have been overturned. If we challenge the past, we shall learn that styles no longer exist for us, that a style belonging to our own period has come about, and there has been a revolution. Now, recently they've been analyzed a bit. Madness and Modernism by Louis Sass. Cognitive Architecture, these are just a few of the titles out there, where Anne Sussman on the right explores the effects of World War I on people like Walter Gropius and Le Corbusier. Might we discover then that form follows dysfunction? She writes, Corbusier must have been suffering, analyzing them from today's psychological point of view. Autistic, Corbusier. Post-traumatic stress disorder, Walter Gropius. Should not have been followed as a role model, but as something to be treated with sympathy, and care. Corbusier was emotionally remote and aesthetically austere. He desired to reduce buildings into geometric components. That could be viewed as a monomania, as evidenced by his own rhetoric, having once said, "I am possessed of the color white, the cube, the sphere, the cylinder, and the pyramid. Take the whip to those who dissent." It's just as tempting to portray Walter Gropius as being permanently scarred by his battlefield experiences. I mean, he ended up multiple times being shot down. He was covered in dead bodies inside of a chimney, recovered from that. He should have been in a hospital basically the rest of his life. Now, these fellows also spent a lot of time hanging out and working with Gnostics, Theosophists, occultists, etc. That's also not in the history books. Not our point today. But their followers and their acolytes do not suffer the great wars, so what is their excuse? This can't be the only reason. These are all award-winning projects since 2019 to 2024. I like to play a game with the students. Where in the world are these? Does it matter? If you don't already have one of these is on its way to your city. One of these is in Denver, Colorado, One River North. One is the Museum of Fine Arts by Stephen Hall in Houston. One is in Dubai, Zaha Hadid. One is the United States Olympic and Paralympic Museum, Colorado Springs. One in Chicago, one Hong Kong, one Paris. Are they telling you about that? There's nothing more unsustainable than an architecture that does not like you and is not going to be loved and is a product of a consumer society. So I asked my students at Benedictine College, what's the relationship between the user and the maker here? Our freshmen also spend the semester immersed in Kenneth Clark's 1969 BBC series Civilization, in which he writes in the final chapter, "At the very beginning of this series, I said that I thought one could tell more about a civilization from its architecture than from anything else it leaves behind. And architecture is to some extent a communal art. At least it depends upon a relationship between the user and the maker much closer than in the other arts." What is this relationship? The product of. There's a key slide really here is in the middle. This is a great sketch by the still living, very good architect, Leon Krier. Of course, you know God is dead, you know the references, so I won't go into that. Leon Krier's sketch says, "I am a house, call me a house. I am a window, call me a window. I am a house, call me a house, door, sorry. And I am a roof, call me a roof." That's the game that's being played, and that's the game of modern architecture. The search for a utopia response to the void left by the death of God is, call it what it is, and I'm not going to let you use your terms, you're on my terms now. The absence of divine moral authority meant that people had to create their own naming system. Adam, the new Adam. Products of this mentality, architecture schools followed suit. Again, Stratford Caldecott writes, "Contemporary education therefore tends to the elimination of meaning, except in the sense of a meaning that we impose by force upon the world." Now, some say we could go back to nature, but nature is not creative. Nature does the same thing over and over and over again in a beautiful way, a wonderful way. That's not how human beings are wired. The naturalistic, the biophilic is not the answer, unless you would like some of these images from the top. The far right on the top is a playground, so that's kind of fun. Yes, yes. These are the types of questions we should be asking, though. What return shall we make to the Lord for all that he's given us? What self-gift prepares us for what we will see in heaven? And of course, we see this plenty of times at these conferences. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Now, quickly, I'm going to fly through because we're over time. This is where it begins. Andrew's father, for whom I worked for many years, he wanted to return to the human. Vitruvius is Vitruvian man. That we return to what is a human being, how is a human being proportioned, what does a human being need to learn, the classical education, even Vitruvius told us about that, what does it mean to be human? And that is what we're tackling at Benedictine College. These are some of the work by the students as they learn to develop their artistic skills, no portfolio necessary to apply, and then we travel, learn how to read the traditions of the world. Obviously, we're in Italy right now. And the students are engaged. And when you allow students to be engaged by these questions about what are we wondering about and what were people doing, either playing, seriously, etc., these are the types of works that our students create. These students look these projects look like something that you have seen, but these are new projects. These are maybe a little bit idealistic, of course. These are students. Schools of Fine Arts. A senior who's studying here now in the Master of Architecture. This building doesn't exist, but if you allow students to move this direction, the play that they actually accomplish is incredible. And so I'll follow up with that final sentence about love. This is a student gallery show where we put up all of our works on the wall for the rest of campus to view. We look at ourselves, we consider ourselves a pilot light program. That means, where is the hearth light still burning in your house? And usually it's in the basement underneath a hot water heater. This is the one we tend to. And this is the one we're based on. In a world that seems to be carrying on, this is a painting by Jerome, The Age of Augustus, 1850s. And when you open up the students' eyes and allow them to dream about what could really happen in a recovery, this is what our students are capable of achieving, a work of love. So, back to the title. Tell us a story from before we can remember. In the film, this is a kind of a montage, but obviously these things are composed and written, so the montages are not really just sort of accidents. One of the children asks his mother, this is a bedtime scene, "Which one of us do you love the most?" She, of course, replies, "I love you all the same." Tell us a story from before we can remember, and then we start to get that reverie sequence of she's flying in an airplane. It's not an accident that I love you each the same. Tell us a story from before we can remember. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And finally, coming to us all the way from Austria, we have Karl Fougerousse. I hope I said that right. Karl Fougerousse earned his BA in philosophy at Franciscan University of Steubenville and his MFA in painting at the New York Academy of Art. He is the founder of Red Fern Studio. As a sculptor, painter, stained glass, and mosaic artist, he has completed large-scale projects for churches all over the U.S. Fougerousse has taught at the Savannah College of Art and Design, the Corcoran College, and Armstrong Atlantic State University. He currently teaches art history and painting at Franciscan University's Study Abroad program in Austria. To see his work, please visit redfernfineartstudio.com. Karl.
Excuse me.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I'm sure we'll get an image here soon. So I'm here to propose a master's degree in fine arts with a concentration in sacred art, and I'm trying to start this up on Franciscan University's Austrian program in Gaming, Austria. So the first, and these are some of my children here. The first thing I'd like to ask you to do if you're a young student is perhaps to take one of these brochures. I have many of them here. There's a survey in here that will allow us to collect some data on how many people are interested in this type of program.
Why is that? Sorry, I'm trying to figure out what's going on here.
So maybe we...
Oh, what?
Okay, that looks promising. So I am, let's see here. I had a feeling this might happen. perfect. Thank you for your patience. So as an artist, I'm most comfortable talking through images and about images. And so I just wanted to show you a few images of works that I've done. So this is a crucifix I did for a church in Jacksonville, Florida a few years ago. Here are some details of that. And coming from this kind of classical tradition, I'm often bewildered coming across images like this, in the same way probably many of you are, or images like this, or imageless churches like this. And I use the word bewildered for a particular reason. This is somewhat alienating. We're perplexed by this. We feel like we've lost our way. We feel like there's something amiss or remiss or missing in 20th century art, even if it's not extraordinarily offensive. There's plenty of that to go around. So without going too much into the problems, where it came from, how it happened, etc., I just wanted to try to chart a way forward of some sort. So what is the path forward? As often, many of the answers can be found in nature, some starting points at least. Rembrandt here in this beautiful landscape gives us this incredible juxtaposition between a natural world in which we have kind of this foreboding, dark, dangerous looking, perhaps mysterious, beautiful and inviting setting, juxtaposed against a cityscape in which this beautiful obelisk reaches towards the heavens and is graced by this ray of light. In this juxtaposition, we also see kind of a back and forth, a bridge connecting them in the foreground. And if you can make these figures out down here, you'll see people exiting the city and entering into the wilderness. So there's a journey happening, and this is the journey that we are on. And this juxtaposition between wandering in the wilderness, so to speak, and dwelling is contingent upon a thing. If we think about our natural sort of ancestral background, where nomadic peoples would follow herds of beasts that they would hunt and eat, and follow the ripening of berries ever further south in the imminent advent of winter, becoming settled is a task that requires a specific type of thing. So this idea of culture being rooted in the word to inhabit requires us to, in a sense, find the means by which we can come to that inhabiting or that indwelling within. And most often it has to do with pushing out to a certain degree the boundaries of that natural wilderness. You can see them cropping up here over the horizon, building a wall perhaps, and then ordering the land into these rows and planting seeds in equal increments. And that ordering of the land allows us to stay in one place and dwell in one place. And of course, that ultimately bears fruit. That's what we want. It allows us to stay there and eat there. And the response for that, the due and proper response for that, is that of gratitude. So if we trace this story of wandering to its origins, we can see that from the very beginning, this is part of it. We are in a garden that does provide, but we eat the wrong fruit, and we are cast out. And this casting out, based off of, as a natural consequence of sin, follows us when Cain slays Abel and is cursed to wander the earth, when the Jews are liberated from captivity and wander the desert for 40 years. So this idea of the meta-narrative of pilgrimage, so to speak, as besetting us from all of time and throughout all of time, is manifest, of course, in our churches as well. In places like this, these beautiful labyrinths on the floors of Gothic cathedrals that the pilgrim can go into, walk, find this winding path, come close to the center, but then be cast out again to the periphery before finally arriving at this beautiful center. Their own innermost self, this encounter with Christ happens there, the ordering happens there, and the flourishing happens there, as seen by this beautiful flower in the center here. And this wandering and walking is, of course, also present in our pilgrimages and in our processionals and in our entrance into Mass. That reminds us of the fact that this wandering is ultimately not aimless, although it may appear to be so. There is an aim, there's a goal in mind that we'll get to in a minute. To help them realize this, the Israelites were given the desert tabernacle as they wandered through the wilderness for 40 years, and this was dictated to be a very specific way by God, because he knew that they were not probably capable of imbuing with sufficient meaning a structure like this, that it would actually enlighten them and guide them. So the measurements of things, the fabrics of things, the materials of things, including the Ark of the Covenant were all specified. And then when they finally got to the Promised Land, this was constructed in stone in a more permanent way, again with very specific measurements. The cube dimensions of the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant dwelt, was important symbolically, as were the cherubim and so on, and the ornament all throughout the holy place with these trees and this ordered garden state. So the idea that the creation narrative expels us, or that in Genesis we are expelled due to our sin. These cherubim are placed at the gate with this flaming sword to prevent us from coming back in. That in the Holy of Holies, or in the Temple of Solomon, we have the built form kind of the atonement, the reunification. You have to enter back into the holy place where you dwell with the menorah representing the seven spirits of God as described in the book of Revelation. This is the Holy Spirit. The bread of presence on the table representing Christ, of course, the manna from heaven, and then entering through this veil that separates us, that has these cherubim depicted on it. We're able to enter into the presence of God the Father, who dwells in the form of a cloud on the Ark of the Covenant. Of course, only in their tradition, the high priest on the Day of Atonement was allowed to go in there. For us, this homecoming looks something like this. Ushering down the aisle in this processional towards Mass, we arrive at the place where Christ, as the Good Shepherd, tends us towards these green pastures that are replenishing this water of life that is refurbishing and restorative. Or even better yet, like this, St. Paul's outside the wall, this beatific vision as seen by St. John in the book of Revelation. And it certainly does not look like this. This instead is the built form of something else, with its horizontality and its drabness. I call these churches the symphony in beige. And its lack of orientation. I can't tell looking at this immediately whether it's looking towards the front or towards the back, and I have to decode the way that the benches are oriented and so on. There's a lack of orientation, a lack of directionality towards the east, towards the rising sun. This is the built form of the desert, the built form of the wandering. It's an empty, drab, dreary, and dead architectural or artistic setting. Now, we've had this before, though. We've had what appears to be a collapse of a great civilization and the decline of the classical world. And as the story goes, that was salvaged by the gathering together of the books, the works that were portable, and brought to these monasteries where people would transcribe them, translate them, make commentaries on them, and try to preserve whatever could be salvaged of Western civilization. This is a Carthusian monastery that did the same thing. These are the seeds, essentially, that were sown throughout all of Europe. And century after century, these seeds that could cultivate a new and bring into flourishing a new civilization spread like wildfire all over Europe and became the centers, ultimately, from which civilization could be salvaged. So the Kartause in Gaming in Austria is our campus. So it seems like the perfect setting for such a revival. So at the very heart of this building, of course, is the chapel. There's another heart in the building as well. It's the library where all these works were studied. Fortunately for us, Andrew, we do have depictions of Old Testament figures. We have the kings and prophets and so on the ceiling. We have the doctors of the church. We have the evangelists. It's a great reminder for us as artists to engage in art as prophecy, art as evangelization, art as teaching, as handed down by the liberal arts depicted in the dome here. So surrounding our students with something that is real, that is in person, going back to the things in themselves is an important part of our program. Indeed, asking them to become those works of art is also an important element, because just as Churchill said, that our buildings shape us after we have shaped them. This idea of culture inhabiting music and architecture, but also painting and sculpture in order to be transformed by this art so that it might bear fruit within us is an important idea. As you can see here, these figures becoming so ordered and transformed that they take on the shape of an equilateral triangle. Now, with regard to this master's degree program, the bar is set pretty high by Western civilization in terms of what can be accomplished. This is Ugolino by Carpeaux that was showed to me as a young student at the New York Academy of Art by our sculpture professor, who said this was his diploma project. This is what I expect of you as well. Of course, schools were different then, 5 or 7 years long, but it just gives you a sense of how complex this can be. Thus, I'm maintaining a minimum of a 2-year program would be necessary for this. And in painting, something similar can be shown. The idea that meticulously rendered underpaintings in monochrome and then gradual layers built on top, like in Da Vinci's work with the brown underpainting, or the terre verte grisaille, the green underpainting that gives incredible optical effects, or the black and white grisaille, or with people like Caravaggio, each one had their own definitive or slightly different way of approaching this, painting light over dark or dark over light. It's hard to even show these things. You really have to see them in person. Everyone from Raphael to Titian to Rembrandt with his dead palette layering up in the face, all originating, of course, in Van Eyck, who made these exquisite visions of perfection. So if I can't show it to you in the slide, because it doesn't show these things, the optical effects, you must go see it in person, of course. And this is counter to this great visual wandering that's happening. People constantly whizzing by billboards on the freeway and scrolling through Instagram. I've seen people walk into museums with a camcorder, film the walls, walk into the next room, right? They're just scrolling through life. And our students are given exercises to draw there, write creative writing projects there, etc. So the restoration of culture spiritually, morally, physically demands a cultivation of the soil in which the love of Christ can grow. So images for me that show that love, that show heroic virtue or wisdom or great insight or tenderness or love, introspection, etc. These are the works that are meaningful to us if we're looking for works that can shape us. And so seeing art history more in the sense of just not just chronicling the transmission of technique or something like this, but rather the memory, discovery, collection, interpretation, organization, and presentation of what it means to be human in these works of art is of utmost importance. So another putting oneself in the presence of something real is the irreplaceable practice of working from a live model, the supreme act of generosity that they contribute towards the production of art is unfathomable to most of us, the idea of sitting there for hours on end, letting people draw from you. And of course, the end of this is not mere realism where we're striving to get every pore and hair follicle and so on depicted or chronicled, but rather this transposing or transfiguration that happens when one looks at these great idealized works of art that remove it from being mundane and enable that mystery of humanity to be preserved. And that's precisely what we're trying to do. We're invited, as Jean Paul II says in his letter to artists, to use our creative intuition to get at the heart of the mystery of the incarnate God and at the mystery of man. So these works of art need to maintain that sense of mystery as well. And here are students working from plaster casts in the Vienna Academy Castor Hall. That's not used, plaster cast hall, it's not used by anyone else other than us. The study of anatomy, of course, is of utmost importance. Again, not for the sake of absolutely meticulously and most scientifically depicting the form, but rather to instill within one's imagination a model of the human body that can be ultimately turned and posed and gestured in any which way, not only even limited by the natural range of movement of the body, but rather with the imagination as the sole limit. So this is the anatomy of possibility that Michelangelo uses in describing these, in crafting these incredible compositions, super complex with figures moving in every direction imaginable, all out of his head. So this is an important practice to construct that vision so that we can ultimately arrive at images like this. So perhaps there is one more point I could make. and that is the idea of composition as being symbolically significant. So these lineages, as we look back in time over compositions in which symbols are being used to describe meanings, for example, the Virgin Mary being the same color as the surrounding architecture, almost blending in an act of humility, but also becoming the container, the enclosure, which is to receive within herself the Christ child. This idea that the architecture is an enclosure, that on the left side, this sinister side, there's a garden closed off. We already saw what that means. And if we think we're starting to imagine these things, perhaps we can look at other images in which it is more explicitly described. For example, this one in which the perspective draws us back in towards the garden in which Adam and Eve are actually being expelled. Time and time again, the building takes on this cosmic element that the temple took on as well, with the starry skies. And in the previous image, we could even see a veil that was separating the Holy of Holies back in there from this element in front. And so it's all about traveling back inward, back towards the garden, but the garden restored, of course. And no matter what these artists that were kind of learning this iconography and understanding how to work with it were doing, they were always drawing upon the same type of language. Mary stands here on the threshold of this very church-like building because she's the gatekeeper. Her fiat is required. Yet it is anticipated in this painting by the fact that the wall that once was a fence impenetrable has now been broken, and spilling out over the edges are these beautiful flowering bushes that are reminiscent of little white flowers that we'll see returning to us in just a second. So no matter who took up this trope, this compositional norm or ideal, with the enclosure and the exterior, they would add new elements, like the bridge between the city on the hill in the background and this landscape in the foreground, separated from the internal realm by this tree. This is what I refer to as the threefold tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the cross, of course, and the tree of life in the heavenly Jerusalem that bears fruit for the restoration of the nations. And Christ, of course, is that fruit that we eat in the Eucharist. So this Eucharistic theme that we see can be seen also in Da Vinci's Annunciation, in which he gives us not just a wall or a broken wall or a picket fence or something like this, but something that much more resembles the altar rail with its opening in the center. The idea that we must also come forth to this wall, kneel, receive the Eucharist, and express our own fiat. We're also receiving Christ within us. And this is further accentuated by some of the choices in the landscape, in particular alluding to the rising and falling of the dew and the hoarfrost-looking flowers in the foreground that are like the manna from heaven. So there's a Eucharistic sign in here. And of course, the Eucharist is one of these seeds. Christ is one of these seeds entering into the world, as Caravaggio shows us here so beautifully, placed in the ground, and yet down below this almost burst like a firework of green coming up from the abyss. So what is Christian culture? Ultimately, essentially, it's the Mass. All these works have great meaning on account of their connection to the Mass. And so we look back at tradition not as something like the worship of ashes, as Gustav Mahler says, but the preservation of fire. These works don't have to look identical to the Fra Angelico one. There can be this evolution. We can yet come up with new variations that draw on the same symbolic language. So for us as Catholics, when we're looking backward and looking forward, we have to keep in mind that as we can see our home both looking backward and forward, that the only path is forward, that the looking back is looking towards the death and the fall, and the looking forward is looking towards the resurrection and the rising sun. Interesting of this one, that it is from these rosary beads, also seeds of a sort, or breadcrumbs kind of beckoning us on. So one last thought here is that this wandering out and returning home that's embodied in all these things ultimately is what we need to be considering now in trying to recreate in these beautiful places a new avenue forward towards art so that we might finally arrive home someday in the near future. Thank you very much. Thanks for letting me go over.
Thank you, Carl. And thank you to each of our panelists. I'm grateful for the work that each of you are doing, especially to train the next generation of young artists and art lovers. We've come to the end of our time. Unfortunately, we don't have time for public questions, but I encourage you to find the speakers throughout the day, maybe now or over lunch, to continue the conversation with them. One final note, we do have a couple of giveaways for you. We have Hunter's Catholic Artist Directory business cards. Carl mentioned that he has his brochures. And then we also have copies of Sacred Architecture Journal on the back counters. It's published by another local sacred architect, Duncan Stroik. And each of these panelists, I think, have been featured in the magazine over the years. So I encourage you to take a copy of that. And thank you all for coming. Please join me once again in thanking our speakers.